Government finances and budgeting. 63. In July 2013, a BEPS action plan was endorsed by the G20, which identified 15 key areas to be addressed by 2015. The OECD work related to BEPS is based on this action plan to equip governments with domestic and international instruments to address the challenge. The 15 key areas range from preventing treaty abuse, re-examination of various aspects of transfer pricing texts, to developing a multilateral instrument to tackle the issue. Use for Government of India. Tax avoidance is a major issue for India. There are several loopholes in domestic tax rules which are used to evade taxes. A large portion of the domestic income is diverted to tax-haven countries like Singapore, Mauritius, and brought back to India in disguise of FDI to avoid taxes on the amounts. Participating in BEPS project would be of huge interest for India. It would enable it to deal with tax avoidance challenges effectively by inculcating some of the best practices followed internationally to tackle such challenges. Government deficits. The budget of government can be deficit, surplus, or balanced depending upon the relation between spending and receipts. In India, given the level of spending needs to be undertaken due to developmental and welfare nature of the government, the budget by its very structure is deficit-oriented. More so, the inflexibility to bring down non-plan expenditure in India would imply reduction of capital expenditure and lesser expenditure in social services in case of any cut down in public expenditure. A balanced budget multiplier is suggested for India, where an incremental increase in any expenditure is met out with corresponding increase in receipts in a given year. Budgetary deficit. It is defined as the difference between total expenditure and total receipts. A deficit may occur in revenue budget or capital budget or both. Thus, budgetary deficit does not provide clear picture of government's borrowing and its liabilities, since economies have begun targeting the revenue deficit and fiscal deficit. Use of budgetary deficit has been discontinued. Budgetary deficit: total expenditure, total receipts. Revenue deficit. It is the difference between revenue expenditure and revenue receipts. Since 1991, the revenue deficit has increased significantly in absolute terms. In 2008-09 and 2009-10, there has been a significant increase in revenue deficit due to fiscal stimuli provided by government in the wake of 2008 global financial crisis. Revenue deficit equals revenue expenditure revenue receipts. Fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit takes place when total expenditure is more than total receipts, but excluding government market borrowings. In other words, fiscal deficit is equal to government's borrowing plus the budgetary deficit and other future liabilities. Fiscal deficit: total expenditure, total tax receipts plus non-debt capital receipts. Primary deficit. It is calculated by deducting interest payments from fiscal deficit. Primary deficit shows what government's fiscal deficit would have been if there was no burden of interest payments on past loans. A low primary deficit means that most of the fiscal deficit is on account of interest payments. In India, a large part of deficit is on account of interest payments, implying a low primary deficit for India. A basic rule is that fiscal deficit should be restricted to 3% of GDP with a balanced budget multiplier. Against this background, the government had set definite time frame for reducing in fiscal and revenue deficits under FRBM, Act 2003. Prolonged fiscal deficits lead to accumulation of debt beyond levels sustainable for an economy and can result in higher interest rates, slower growth in capital formation, and potentially lower the rate of output growth. 64. General Studies, Mains, Paper 3. High level of fiscal deficit is bad for economy as it fuels inflation and affects credit ratings, resulting in costlier market borrowings. Further, it crowds out the private investment, leads to high debt service payment, and is responsible for generating black money. High current account deficit is also a manifestation of high fiscal deficit. Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, FRBM Act. The FRBM-ACI is a legislative step enacted by the government in 2003 to ensure fiscal discipline by setting targets including reduction of fiscal deficits and elimination of revenue deficit. The main objective of the act was to introduce the legislative mechanism for a more equitable and manageable distribution of the country's debts over the years. The FRBM's mandate 4 fiscal indicators to be projected in the medium-term fiscal policy statement. These are Black Circle revenue deficit as a percentage of GDP, fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP, tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, Black Circle total outstanding liabilities as a percentage of GDP. The FRBM rules directed the central government to place in each financial year before House of Parliament in 3 statements: medium-term fiscal policy statement, fiscal policy strategy statement, and macroeconomic framework statement, along with annual financial statement and demand for grants. Recommendations of FRBM Review Committee. The FRBM Act has been successively amended to make headway for government fiscal deficit and also in accordance with financial crisis such as in 2008. In 2016, the N.K. Singh Committee was constituted to review the FRBM Act. Recommendations of the committee are: Black Circle government should target a fiscal deficit of 3% of GDP in years up to March 2020. Later in 2021 and 2022, it must be brought down to 2.8 and 2.5% respectively. Help. N. A. Th. A. They. It recommended for a debt to GDP ratio of 60% with 40% limit for the center and 20% limit for the states. The revenue deficit should be reduced to 0.8% of GDP by the 31st of March 2023. The minimum annual reduction target was 0.5% of GDP. The fiscal deficit should be reduced to 2.5% of GDP by the 31st of March 2023. The minimum annual reduction target was 0.3% of GDP. The Act exempts the government from following the FREM guidelines in case of war or calamity. It also introduced escape clause in the Act under which government can flexibly follow fiscal deficit target during special circumstances, after formal consultation and advice of the Fiscal Council. Fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation implies employment of strategies which are aimed at minimizing deficits while preventing the accumulation of more debt in future. Trail can be achieved by cutting down subsidies and curtailing leakages therein. Further steps such as reforming the tax structure, improving the performance of PSUs, and undertaking austerity measures would also. Kelkar Committee Report on Fiscal Consolidation. The Vijay Kelkar Committee, which was given the task of preparing a fiscal consolidation plan, has suggested number of steps, which are given below. Reduce subsidy to 2% of GDP in 2013-14 and 1.8% in 2014-15. From a projected 2.6% in 2012-13. Immediate increase in the price of diesel by 4 liter, that of kerosene by 2 liter, and cooking gas by 250 per cylinder. Instead of subsidies provision for diesel, kerosene, GIS, moved to system of market-based price by March 2014. Implement goods and service tax, reduce excise and service tax rates to 8%. A 360 profile of all tax-paying individual and institutions should be created to help decrease tax evasion and tax fraud. The proposed food security bill should be appropriately phased, taking into account the present difficult fiscal challenge. Government finances and budgeting. 65. Budgeting in India. The annual financial statement, or the statement of the estimated receipts and expenditure of the Government of India in respect of each financial year is popularly known as the budget. Components of government budget. Components of government budget are as follows. Revenue budget. It consists of the revenue receipts of the government, lax revenues and other revenues, and the expenditure met from these revenues. Tax revenues comprise proceeds of taxes and other shoots levied. Government mainly consist of interest and dividend on investments made by the government, etc. By the Union. Other revenues or receipts of the capital budget. It consists of capital receipts and payments. It also incorporates transactions in the public account. Capital receipts are loans raised by the government from the public, known as market loans, borrowings by the government from the Reserve Bank and other parties through treasury bills, loans received from foreign bodies and governments, and recoveries of loans granted by the central government to state and UIS and other parties. Types of budgeting. Following types of budget are used all over the world. Traditional budgeting. A traditional budget indicates the amount of money you allot during a set time period for specific financial obligations, such as rent, entertainment, or insurance. The budget is designed to help you spend your income according to a plan. A traditional budget starts with your income and lists the categories on which you expect to spend your money. At the end of the time period, if you keep accurate records, you should know how closely your spending matched your intentions. Outcome budgeting. An outcome budget measures the development outcomes of all government programs. For instance, it will tell a citizen if money has been allocated for building a primary health center, has it indeed come up? In other words, it is a means to develop a linkage between the money spent by government and the results which follow. Zero-based budgeting. A method of budgeting is that in which all expenses must be justified for each new period. Zero-based budgeting, ZBB, starts from a zero base, and every function within an organization is analyzed for its needs and costs. Budgets are then built around what is needed for the upcoming period, regardless of whether the budget is higher or lower than the previous one. ZBB allows top-level to strategic goals to be implemented into the budgeting process by tying them to specific functional areas of the organization, where costs can be first grouped, then measured against previous results and current expectations. Balanced budgeting. A balanced budget, particularly that of a government, refers to a budget in which revenues are equal to expenditures. Thus, neither a budget deficit nor a budget surplus exists, the accounts balance. More generally, it refers to a budget that has no budget deficit, but could possibly have a budget surplus. Gender budgeting. Gender budgeting refers to the process of conceiving, planning, approving, executing, monitoring, analyzing and auditing budgets in a gender-sensitive way. It involves analysis of actual expenditure and revenue, usually of governments, on women and girls as compared to expenditures on men and boys. Single budgeting. The single budget is used by all the departments, program of government. All of the government's income and expenditure is included in single budgeting. Federal Budget of America and Britain are examples of single budgeting system. '66. General Studies, Mains, Paper 2. Multi-budgeting. It refers to the use of different budgets in different departments and programs of government. Many countries like France, Switzerland, Germany, etc. use multi-budgeting system. Item-based budgeting. Demand of fund without showing its expenditure department-wise corners under item-based budgeting. Vote on account is example of item-based budgeting. Vote on account deals only with the expenditure side of the government's budget. Supplementary budgeting. The need to reconsider already passed budget is certainly due to unexpected reasons like natural calamity, decline in revenue or some other emerging circumstances, and supplementary budget is formed to fulfill new demands and activities or to increase existing services. Process of budgeting. The budget process in India comprises 4 distinct phases. 1. Budget formulation, the preparation of estimates of expenditure and receipts for the ensuing financial year. Budget enactment, approval of the proposed budget by the legislature through the enactment of Finance Bill and Appropriation Bill. Budget execution, enforcement of the provisions in the Finance Act and Appropriation Act by the government, collection of receipts and making disbursements for various services as approved by the legislature. Legislative review of budget. Implementation audits of government's financial operations on behalf of the legislature. Presentation of budget. The procedure for presentation of the budget and its passing by Lok Sabha is as laid down in Articles 112 to 117 of the Constitution of India. The budget papers are made available to members after the finance minister's speech is over. The finance bill is introduced and the House is adjourned for the day. Advancement of budget presentation date. The Cabinet had decided to advance the presentation of the Union budget by a month, from February to January in 2016. The advancement of date was effective from 2017. The objective was to have the budget constitutionally approved by Parliament and assented to by the President, and all allocations at different tiers disseminated to budget holders, before the financial year begins on the 1st of April. The new system will eliminate the need for the executive to obtain a vote on account budget approval to incur expenditure during the first 2 months, which normally is in the second fortnight of May. The aim is that all spending authorities within the system and those financially dependent on the center be in a position to work out their activities with assured resources in the beginning of the year itself. With annual financial resources approved and bestowed on the 1st of April, a more planned and regulated expenditure profile during the year is expected. Discussion on the budget. No discussion on budget takes place on the day it is presented to the House. Budgets are discussed in 2 stages: the general discussion followed by detailed discussion and voting on the demands for grants. General discussion on the budget. During the general discussion, the House is at liberty to discuss the budget as a whole or any question of principles involved therein, but no motion can be moved. After the general discussion on the budget is over, the House is adjourned for a fixed period. During this period, the demands for grants of the ministries, departments are considered by the committees. Discussion on demands for grants after the reports of the standing committees are presented to the House. The House proceeds to the discussion and voting on demands for grants, ministry-wise. At this stage, cut motions can be moved to reduce any demand. Government finances and budgeting. 67. For grant but no amendments to a motion seeking to reduce any demand is permissible. The Speaker decides whether a cut motion is or is not admissible and may disallow any cut motion when in his opinion it is an abuse of the right of moving cut motions or is calculated to obstruct or prejudicially affect the procedure of the House or is in contravention of the rules of procedure of the House. Guillotine on the last of the allotted days for the discussion and voting on demands for grants. At the appointed time, the Speaker puts every question necessary to dispose of all the outstanding matters in connection with the demands for grants. This is known as guillotine. The guillotine concludes the discussion on demands for grants. IV. Vote on account as the whole process of budget beginning with its presentation and ending with discussion and vote of demands for grants and passing of the appropriation bill and the finance bill generally goes beyond the current financial year provision has been made in the Constitution empowering the Lok Sabha to make any grant in advance through a vote on account to enable the government to carry on until the vote of demands for grants and the passing of the appropriation bill and finance bill. Vote on account is passed by Lok Sabha after the general discussion on the budget is over and before the discussion on demands for grants is taken up. As a convention, vote on account is treated as a formal matter and passed by Lok Sabha without discussion. V. Appropriation bill after the demands for grants have been passed by the House. A bill to provide for the appropriation out of the Consolidated Fund of India of all money required to meet the grants and the expenditure charged on the Consolidated Fund of India is introduced, considered and passed. V. Finance bill. Finance bill means a bill ordinarily introduced every year to give effect to the financial proposals of the Government of India for the following financial year and includes a bill to give effect to supplementary financial proposals for any period. The finance bill is introduced immediately after the presentation of the budget. As the finance bill contains taxation proposals, it is considered and passed by the Lok Sabha only after the demands for grants have been voted and the total expenditure is known. Merger of railway budget with general budget. The decades-old practice of presenting two budgets, i.e. the railway and the general budget separately, had come to an end. From 2017, the two budgets were merged into one and Railway Minister would not be presenting his own budget further. This step was long overdue and it will improve the efficiency of expenditure that the government is incurring in various sectors like infrastructure, etc. The railway budget was being presented separately because of historical reasons, but in past few years this has created problems for functioning of railways, as it made the decision-making process very politicized, like setting of tariffs, which will come to an end with the merger. Financial autonomy of the railways should be preserved as it works round the clock, runs 20,000 trains per day, and decisions are to be taken on a lot of issues on a daily basis. Railway Minister has lot of power to take decision on the funds. He can transfer the funds to the projects which are more urgent, take out money from those projects which were lagging behind to put into important areas. The purpose of this merger is to develop railways fast. Railway gets required help from the National Exchequer for its projects. Right now, Railway gets General Budgetary Support, GBS, which should increase after the merger as Railway will not gain anything if it decreases.